If you still remember how to carry a
How did she get
tray,
in here?
use the staff entrance.
I thought she lost.
Imani Dube said it with a smile so polished, it almost sounded elegant. Almost. The women standing beside her laughed into their champagne glasses. Not loudly, not recklessly, but in the careful way rich people laugh when they want to wound someone without appearing vulgar. Zahra Mensah stood at the foot of the grand staircase inside the Lion's Crown Hotel, one hand resting lightly on the black railing, her face calm, unreadable, untouched by the insult Imani had prepared so proudly. Above them, crystal chandeliers threw warm gold across marble floors. Around them, Johannesburg's wealthiest families moved beneath designer fabric, diamonds, and old money confidence. Politicians, mining heirs, private equity executives, media moguls, and celebrities filled the ballroom with the soft noise of power recognizing itself. Everything about the evening was built to remind people who belonged and who did not. And according to Imani, Zahra definitely did not. "I sent your invitation because I thought it might be healing," Imani continued, her tone dipped in false kindness. "Closure is important, especially when a woman has to watch the life she almost had become someone else's reality." This time the laughter came a little easier. Zahra looked at her for a moment, then let her eyes drift past Imani's silver gown, past the diamond collar at her throat, past the rows of people pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Her gaze settled on the ballroom doors, then the stage, then the massive brass clock above the mezzanine. 11:21 p.m. 39 minutes to midnight. Then she looked back at Imani and smiled softly. "You should enjoy the night," Zahra said. "Some people only own a room for a few hours before the lights change." Imani's smile flickered, briefly. So briefly most people would have missed it. But not Tade Balewa. He was standing 6 feet away with a whiskey glass in one hand and the familiar expression of a man who had spent years believing every room belonged to him. Zahra's ex-husband had not changed in the ways that mattered. He was still devastatingly composed, still perfectly dressed, still carrying the old confidence of inherited power and self-made arrogance fused into something dangerous. The same man who once whispered promises against her shoulder in Nairobi. The same man who later taught her how expensive cruelty could look in public. When his eyes met hers, something unreadable crossed his face. Not guilt, not warmth, not even regret. It was something colder than that. Recognition. Because somewhere behind all the noise, all the silk, all the status, Tade Balewa felt what no one else in that ballroom yet understood. Something was wrong. Very wrong. 3 years earlier, Zahra had lived inside another kind of gold light. At the beginning, Tade loved to tell people he had found her in a room full of experts and chosen the only person there who wasn't impressed by him. They met at an infrastructure conference in Nairobi, where Zahra, then a hospitality strategist from Accra, challenged a panel full of investors who spoke about Africa like it was an opportunity map, instead of a continent full of people. Tade had laughed afterward, approached her at the coffee station, and told her she was either very brave or very dangerous. "Maybe both," she said. He adored that answer. Back then he listened when she spoke. He admired her precision. He admired how she noticed the invisible systems beneath luxury, the workers, the timing, the architecture of comfort, the economics behind elegance. Where other people saw chandeliers and prestige, Zahra saw margins, staffing models, guest psychology, waste points, forgotten assets, neglected communities, and rooms full of people paying extra to feel important. Tade said she was brilliant, said she made him sharper, said he had never met a woman who understood ambition without apologizing for it. In those early months, he called her his equal. In private, he called her his future. In public, he called her extraordinary. And because love can be most convincing right before it becomes a weapon, Zahra believed him. Their wedding made headlines in business magazines across East and Southern Africa. The pictures were beautiful. Her smile was real. His hand at her waist looked possessive in the way magazines described as romantic. The venue overlooked the ocean. The speeches were smooth. The champagne never stopped. Powerful men praised Tade's global vision. Stylish women admired Zahra's poise. Everyone said they looked modern, brilliant, unstoppable. Nobody saw the first fracture, because the first fracture almost never looks like violence. It looks like a joke. It looks like a pause after someone insults you and your husband does not defend you. It looks like his mother smiling too sweetly when she says, "You speak so well." It looks like dinner invitations where you were introduced only as Tade's wife, never by your profession, your degrees, your achievements, or your name. It looks like a socialite asking if you had to adjust to luxury. It looks like your husband laughing softly instead of correcting her. When Zahra moved to Johannesburg after the wedding, the Balewa family welcomed her into a world that seemed breathtaking from the outside and exhausting from within. Tade's mother, Adesua Balewa, carried wealth the way royals carry history. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her disapproval arrived gift-wrapped in manners. At brunch, she would ask Zahra whether Accra had restaurants of this standard. At private dinners, she would explain family traditions as though speaking to a scholarship student. At charity galas, she praised Zahra's beauty in the same tone some people use for rare furniture. And Tade, little by little, did what ambitious men often do when forced to choose between love and acceptance. He adapted. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. He just stopped interrupting when people reduced her, stopped inviting her into serious conversations, stopped asking what she thought in rooms where her opinion once excited him. He began correcting her in public, then dismissing her in private, then joking about her background to loosen wealthy investors who wanted evidence that he understood the rules of their world. Every time he did it, something inside him hardened, and something inside Zahra learned. The first truly unforgivable moment happened during a private dinner at the family penthouse in Sandhurst. A cabinet minister had just complimented the imported art in the hallway when another guest turned to Zahra and asked, "So what exactly do you do all day? I mean now, not before." Before Zahra could answer, Tade smiled over his wine glass and said, "She's adjusting to retirement from having opinions." The table laughed. Not because it was funny, because Tade Balewa had spoken. And in rooms like that, power manufactures humor. Zahra remembered feeling the blood drain from her face. She remembered the heavy silence that followed inside her own body, that internal stillness that comes when humiliation lands too cleanly to fight immediately. She remembered waiting for him to fix it, to say he was joking, to reach for her hand beneath the table. He did none of those things. Later that night, when she asked him why he would say something like that, he barely looked up from his phone. "You take everything too personally," he said. It was personal. It was social. The distinction mattered to him. That was when she understood he had begun confusing cruelty with sophistication. Months passed, then more. The marriage did not collapse in one cinematic explosion. It thinned. It starved. It became a series of elegant injuries disguised as lifestyle. Tade grew more careful in public and colder in private. He started speaking to Zahra as though explaining the world to someone far less intelligent than himself. Whenever she mentioned restarting her consulting work, he said it was unnecessary. Whenever she brought up expanding into independent hospitality strategy, he asked who would take her seriously without Balewa connections. Whenever she studied market reports or made notes on hotel acquisitions, he smiled the way adults smile when children describe impossible futures. One rainy evening, he found her at the dining table surrounded by occupancy data, debt restructuring notes, and sketches of possible boutique redesign concepts for distressed urban properties. He flipped through the papers and laughed. "A hotel group?" he said. "You?" Zahra took the pages back from him carefully. Not a fantasy, a plan. Tade loosened his cufflinks and leaned against the bar. "Do you know why people respect me? Because my name opens locked doors. Because families return my calls. Because bankers answer before the second ring. Because nobody has to wonder whether I belong at the table." His eyes lowered to the papers in her hand. "You are bright, Zahra, but brightness is not power. Without my world, you would still be outside looking in." She had gone still after that. Then she asked the question he would later remember with a kind of private horror. "What if I build a world that doesn't need you?" He laughed, harshly, confidently, completely. "Then build it," he said. "I would love to see the miracle." The miracle began in silence. Zahra had never been reckless. She understood systems, which meant she understood that freedom was usually assembled before it was announced. While Tade assumed her hope had died, she began collecting pieces of escape. She reviewed household expenditures, cut what she could quietly cut, sold gifts he had forgotten giving her, reconnected with former colleagues in Ghana, Kenya, and Rwanda, took remote strategic work under a consulting alias, studied distressed hospitality assets across southern Africa, learned which family offices were over-leveraged, which urban landmarks carried sentimental value but no modern profitability, which boutique properties had good bones and bad management, which lenders were willing to offload underperforming notes for less than reputation could admit. And above all, she listened. Because once people stop seeing you as important, they start speaking freely around you. Zahra heard things while standing near terraces, while waiting in lobbies, while being ignored at tables. She heard which hotels were late on payroll, which owners were trapped in debt, which buildings were culturally beloved but financially bleeding. She began keeping names, numbers, timelines, and risk patterns in encrypted files under harmless labels. Tade never noticed. He did not notice because men raised inside unquestioned privilege often confuse a woman's silence with emptiness. By the time Zahra asked for a divorce, she had already built the skeleton of a future. He was offended more than heartbroken. At the signing, seated across from her in an office wrapped in wood paneling and old legal authority, Tade adjusted his watch and said, "You'll be back in 6 months, maybe less. This city is merciless to people without protection." Zahra signed her name. Then she looked at him with a calmness he did not understand. "Mercy is overrated," she said. "Competence lasts longer." He thought about that sentence exactly 0 times over the next year. Then he would think about it every night. The first months after the divorce were not glamorous. There was no triumphant soundtrack, no secret inheritance, no miracle investor waiting at the airport with a black card and a blessing. There was only exhaustion, rejection, and the humiliating intimacy of rebuilding from scratch. She rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Rosebank with a leaking balcony door and a refrigerator that complained louder than she ever did. She worked almost constantly. Daytime consulting, evening market analysis, midnight proposal writing, early morning investor outreach. She traveled economy with a stiff neck and a laptop full of revised numbers. She took meetings with men who praised her intelligence while asking who was really behind the deal. She sat across from lenders who said the assets she liked were too ambitious for someone at her stage. She watched rooms change temperature when richer, louder, more connected people entered. But unlike her marriage, work had one advantage. It was honest. When a deal failed, it failed in daylight. When prejudice appeared, it wore a suit and called itself caution. When someone underestimated her, she could write it down, price it in, and move accordingly. That was easier than loving someone who weaponized your trust. The business she built first was not a hotel empire. It was a rescue service. Zahra launched a discreet hospitality turnaround consultancy focused on boutique properties nobody in high finance considered glamorous enough to chase. Old guest houses near cultural districts, legacy restaurants attached to decaying buildings, family-owned lodges with good reputations and terrible books. She restructured staffing, redesigned pricing, modernized service flows, retrained management, renegotiated supplier contracts, and reintroduced local cultural value where bland luxury had once drained the soul from a space. Her genius was not decoration, it was dignity. She knew how to make people pay premium prices to feel meaning, not just status. She knew that the future of African luxury was not imitation of Europe. It was memory, craftsmanship, story, place, rhythm, generosity, architecture, and authority without apology. Her clients began making money, then more money, then talking about her carefully in circles that once would not have seated her at lunch. She named the company Amani House Holdings. Quiet name, serious work, no noise. By the second year, Zahra had enough reputation to stop chasing every contract and start choosing strategy. She built relationships with diaspora investors who had grown tired of watching beautiful African assets be mismanaged, extracted, or cosmetically modernized into soulless copies of foreign dreams. She partnered with two women, one from Lagos, one from Kigali, who understood balance sheets and long memory. Together, they created a private investment vehicle designed to acquire distressed hospitality properties with cultural significance and commercial potential. That was when she began studying the Lion's Crown Hotel. The Lion's Crown was one of Johannesburg's oldest symbols of elite prestige. Politicians made alliances there. Scandals were born there. Billionaires celebrated there. Engagements, elections, and betrayals all passed beneath its chandeliers. To the public, it looked untouchable. To Zahra's eye, it looked exhausted. The staff turnover was rising. The banquet business hid deeper structural losses. The owners were asset-rich, cash-poor, and privately overexposed after a disastrous expansion into Mauritius and London. The heirs cared about appearances. The lenders cared about recovery. The building itself, however, was magnificent, perfectly located, emotionally iconic, operationally bloated, strategically underused, a sleeping giant wearing old perfume. Zahra did not try to buy the hotel directly. That would have alerted too many people too quickly. Instead, she waited. Then she began buying pieces of the debt. Not in her own name, not in a flashy way. through a layered consortium, through patient conversations, through investors who understood silence as a strategy. When the hotel's ownership group missed another covenant threshold and panic moved quietly through the back end, Amani House was already positioned. By the time the Lions Crown Board realized how vulnerable they were, Zahra was no longer outside the gate. She was in the paperwork. Tade Balewa first heard the name Amani House Holdings during an infrastructure dinner and dismissed it as one of the countless mid-level firms wealthy men pretend to notice, while actually listening only for threat. The second time he heard it was from a banker describing clever hospitality plays led by disciplined operators. He still did not care. The third time, his fiancée Imani mentioned that some old money family had lost a boutique property in Cape Town to that quiet, woman-led group everyone is suddenly pretending to respect. He smirked and returned to his phone. He should have looked closer then. He didn't, because danger is easiest to ignore when it arrives dressed in patience. Imani, meanwhile, had become the perfect public partner for a man like Tade. She was beautiful in the way magazines love, and ruthless in the way society forgives when it arrives with jewelry. She understood hierarchy instinctively. She knew how to flatter older women, embarrass quieter ones, and place her cruelty under silk gloves so no one could accuse her of vulgarity. She also understood one more thing with irritating accuracy. There were unfinished rooms inside Tade's mind where Zahra still existed. He never spoke about his ex-wife unless forced. He acted as though the marriage had been a youthful misalignment, a brief error corrected by maturity and good judgment. But sometimes, at events, when he saw a woman with Zahra's posture, or heard someone say "Accra" with the same musical precision she used, something in his face shifted. Imani noticed everything. So when the Lions Crown scheduled its annual Founders Gala, the most photographed elite gathering on their social calendar, Imani saw an opportunity. The gala would be huge. Politicians, international investors, legacy families, cameras, fashion pages, business pages, society pages, all the usual worshippers at the altar of visibility. And she wanted a small spectacle, nothing dramatic, just enough to settle a quiet insecurity she would never confess. "Invite Zahra," she said one evening while reviewing seating charts in Tade's penthouse. Tade looked up immediately. "Why?" Imani smiled. "Because people still remember her. They whisper sometimes. They wonder what became of the woman who thought she would become Mrs. Balewa and rule the city." She never thought that. Imani turned her eyes toward him with interest. "You sound defensive." "I sound bored." "No," she said softly. "You sound careful." He said nothing. She came around the table and rested her hand against the back of his chair. "Let her come. Let everybody see how life works. Let them see who remained inside the circle and who vanished outside it. If she's thriving, fine. If not, even better. Either way, the story ends in public." He disliked the idea immediately, which was exactly why Amani enjoyed it. "Do whatever you want," he said at last. That was all she needed. The invitation arrived at Zahra's office 3 days later in cream cardstock with a gold-embossed seal and language dripping with false warmth. She read it once, then twice. Her assistant, Nandi, watched her carefully. "Will you go?" Zahra's gaze moved to the preliminary acquisition documents open on her desk. The closing window had narrowed. The final debt transfer and emergency recapitalization package for the Lions Crown would complete the night of the gala, timed to stabilize the property before public market panic could attach itself to rumor. The current owners wanted secrecy until the last possible second. The lenders wanted signatures, not attention. Amani House wanted control. And fate, apparently, wanted theater. Zahra folded the invitation and placed it beside the contract folder. "Yes," she said. Nandi blinked. "Just like that?" Zahra looked at her with a calm, almost amused expression. "When arrogant people build the stage themselves," she said, "it is rude not to arrive." The week before the gala, the city buzzed with its usual rehearsed obsession. Designers sent gowns. Security teams rehearsed routes. Media outlets speculated about guest lists and mergers and rumored proposals. The lion's crown polished every visible surface while quietly bleeding behind the scenes. Senior staff smiled through uncertainty. Bankers traded careful messages. Lawyers reviewed signatures that would decide whether the hotel remained in family hands or passed into new control by midnight. Zahra worked without fanfare. No extravagant entrance plan, no petty revenge rehearsal, no speech full of poison. That was important, because the best reversals do not require theatrics. They require timing. On the afternoon of the gala, she stood alone in her apartment dressing room before a long mirror framed in matte black wood. The gown she chose was custom but restrained. Deep espresso velvet with sculpted shoulders, a clean neckline, and hand-beaded detailing so subtle it revealed itself only under direct light. It did not scream for attention. It assumed it. Her jewelry was minimal, her makeup precise. Her hair swept into a structured style that framed her face like certainty. Nandi, standing in the doorway, exhaled softly. "They won't know what hit them." Zahra adjusted one cuff. "That isn't the goal." "What is?" She turned from the mirror. "To walk in without needing their permission." By 10:40 p.m., the ballroom at the Lion's Crown was glowing with money. Tade stood beneath a chandelier speaking to a telecom investor, while Imani accepted praise as though it were rent she was owed. The orchestra played softly near the West Terrace. Journalists drifted like elegant predators at the edges of significance. Waiters moved with polished invisibility. Old enemies kissed cheeks. New alliances formed over lobster and lies. Imani was radiant and unbearable. "This room is exactly how power should feel," she told a circle of women dressed in couture. Zahra entered 11 minutes later, not through the staff entrance, through the front. The first thing people noticed was not her dress. It was her composure. There is a certain kind of silence that enters a room before a name returns to memory. A slowing, a shift, an instinctive turn of heads by people who do not yet know why they are turning. That silence moved through the ballroom as Zahra crossed the threshold beneath the carved archway and paused just long enough for the room to register what it was seeing. Some recognized her instantly. Some only remembered the story. Some remembered the color of scandal, but not its details. But all of them felt the same thing. She did not look like a woman arriving to be judged. She looked like someone measuring the room. Imani recovered first. "My goodness," she said, approaching with wide, gleaming eyes. "You actually came." "I said I would." "How brave." "How organized," Zahra corrected gently. Tade had already turned. Their eyes met across the final few feet. For a second, the noise of the ballroom thinned. The years between them did not disappear, but they compressed into something sharp enough to taste. "You look well," he said. "I am well." His gaze lingered for half a second longer than it should have. Not on her dress, on her face, on the ease there, on the absence of need. Imani slipped one arm through his and smiled at Zahra as if they were all participating in a very tasteful ritual. "We're so glad you could witness such a special night," she said. "There's something satisfying about seeing how life arranges people in the end." Zahra looked at her, then at the ballroom, then briefly at the brass clock above the mezzanine. 11:43 p.m. 17 minutes to midnight. "Yes," she said softly. "There is." The next part of the evening unsettled Tade more than any confrontation would have. Zahra did not cling to the edges of the room. She did not look overwhelmed. She did not flinch beneath glances or whispers. She moved through the ballroom with serene precision, greeting the hotel's senior events manager by name, thanking a former minister's wife for a note she had once sent about urban restoration, exchanging 2 sentences with a Rwandan investor, then 3 with a Kenyan architect, then pausing near a side corridor where the Lion's Crown's chief legal officer greeted her with barely disguised respect. Tade saw it. Imani saw it too. "Why is Conrad Maseko speaking to her like that?" Imani murmured through a fixed smile. Tade did not answer, because he had just watched the hotel's legal officer incline his head. Not socially, professionally. At 11:49 p.m., the chairman of the Lion's Crown stepped onto the stage. The orchestra quieted. A microphone hummed once, then stilled. Conversations folded inward. Guests turned with the easy entitlement of people expecting another speech about legacy, philanthropy, or strategic expansion. The chairman, an older man named Daniel Mokwena, adjusted his glasses and thanked everyone for attending. He spoke of history, of heritage, of economic headwinds, of preserving institutions. Tade listened with half an ear. Imani scanned the room for photographers. Zahra stood near the center aisle, one hand resting lightly against a champagne flute she had never actually sipped from. Then, Daniel Mokwena said the sentence that split the room open. "Tonight," he announced, "before the close of this evening, the Lion's Crown enters a new chapter under new controlling ownership." The ballroom changed shape. No one moved dramatically, but the energy shifted so hard it almost sounded physical. Guests began glancing at one another. Executives straightened. Journalists reached for phones. Family members from the current ownership group visibly stiffened at their tables. The chairman continued, explaining debt restructuring, preservation commitments, staff retention assurances, and a long-term redevelopment strategy rooted in African luxury rather than imported mimicry. Tade lowered his glass slowly. Imani's smile faded. Neither of them yet understood. Then, Daniel Mokwena turned slightly toward the front row and said, "It is my honor to welcome the principal of Amani House Holdings, the woman whose vision made this rescue possible, Ms. Zahra Mensah." No one clapped immediately. Shock delays sound. For a single clean second, the ballroom existed in complete silence. Then heads turned. First one section, then another, then all at once, as if the entire room had become a single organism and its spine had just been touched. The silence broke not into applause, but into stunned disbelief. Sharp whispers, broken breaths, the beginning of names spoken too quickly. Tade's face emptied. Imani actually took a step back, and Zahra, calm, upright, unhurried, placed her champagne flute on a passing tray and walked toward the stage. Every camera in the room followed her. Every journalist lifted a device. Every old rumor about the forgotten ex-wife burned to ash under the weight of what was now publicly visible. When Zahra reached the stage, Daniel Mokoena extended his hand. She took it, not with triumph, with authority. He then signaled to a legal aide who brought forward a dark wooden presentation case lined in velvet. Inside it rested the ceremonial brass master key of the lion's crown, a symbolic object used only when ownership changed hands. The chairman lifted it and said into the microphone, "At 11:58 p.m., effective upon final transfer confirmation, this hotel passes into the stewardship of Amani House Holdings." He turned and handed the key to Zahra. This time the room did clap, not out of kindness, out of impact. The sound crashed across the ballroom in waves, applause, gasps, furious whispering, chairs shifting, phones recording, old names suddenly less important than the woman standing under the chandelier light, holding the future of the room in one hand. Tade could not breathe properly, because the detail slicing deepest into him was not that Zahra had become wealthy, not that she had become respected, not even that she had bought one of Johannesburg's most iconic hotels. It was that she had done it in the exact language he thought she would never master. Leverage, timing, silence, control. She had not begged for a seat at the table. She had acquired the table, and he had invited her to it. Imani recovered just enough to whisper, "No." But the word meant nothing. Around them, people were already recalibrating. That is what elite rooms do best. They do not apologize for underestimating you. They simply pivot their admiration toward whoever now controls access. The women who had laughed with Imani 20 minutes earlier were suddenly discussing Zahra's vision. Men who once ignored her name were asking each other who introduced Amani House to the lenders. Socialites who would have described her as Tade's ex now said Ms. Mensah with fascinated reverence. The room had not become morally better. It had become strategically honest. When the applause eased, Daniel offered Zahra the microphone. She took it. The ballroom settled instantly. Some expected revenge. Some expected tears. Some expected a speech about women's empowerment polished for headlines. What they got was far more dangerous. Zahra looked out across the faces in front of her. Politicians, bankers, heirs, society women, men who respected only scale, women who confused cruelty with breeding, people who had spent years believing power only counted when inherited, married, or performed through male endorsement. Then she spoke. "This building was never failing because it lacked beauty," she said. "It was failing because too many people confused prestige with stewardship." No one moved. Her voice was controlled, low, and clear enough to cut through silk. "Luxury is not chandeliers. It is trust. It is memory. It is whether the people carrying trays can still afford to feed their children while billionaires discuss legacy beneath imported flowers. It is whether a place remembers where it stands and who built the ground under it." Across the ballroom, an editor lowered her pen just to listen. Zahra continued. "Amani House did not acquire the lion's crown to imitate anyone else's idea of elegance. We acquired it because African excellence does not need foreign permission to define refinement. This hotel will remain powerful, but it will no longer survive on appearance alone." A few people were already clapping, but she raised one hand slightly and the room quieted again. "Some people think ownership begins when a room recognizes your name," she said. "I have learned the opposite. Ownership begins the moment you stop asking a room to tell you who you are." Complete silence. Then applause again, harder now. Because truth, when spoken without trembling by the person a room expected to pity, becomes unforgettable. Tade stood frozen inside it. For the first time in years, he saw himself from outside himself. Not as the admired financier, not as the cultivated heir, not as the man everyone turned toward when money entered the room. He saw a smaller thing. A man who had once held brilliance close enough to protect it and instead treated it like a disposable reflection of his own status. He remembered her notes spread across a table. He remembered dismissing her plans. He remembered saying no one would take her seriously without his name. And now, hundreds of people were applauding because her name had just taken theirs hostage. Imani's humiliation was more visible. She looked as beautiful as ever and suddenly almost irrelevant, which in rooms like that can feel like social death. The cameras that had adored her earlier were no longer facing her. The journalists crowding the edge of the stage were not asking about her gown, her engagement, or her seat at Tade's side. They wanted Zahra, her strategy, her investors, her redevelopment vision, her acquisition model, her story. Several even asked how long the negotiation had been underway. Zahra answered without glancing toward Tade. "Long enough," she said, "to understand exactly what this building needed." At 12:03 a.m., 5 minutes after midnight, the final transfer confirmation came through. The legal officer nodded to Daniel Mokoena. Daniel smiled broadly and announced, "It is complete." That was when the room truly changed, because suspense had ended. This was no longer a dramatic possibility. It was ownership. Actual, signed, and forcible ownership. A few members of the former ownership family looked ill. Bankers looked relieved. Staff looked confused, then cautiously hopeful. Guests looked thrilled to have witnessed history from a safe distance. And Imani, still gripping her champagne flute too tightly, realized something dreadful. She had invited Zahra to a gala at a hotel Zahra was about to own. Not metaphorically, literally. A senior floor manager approached, clearly awaiting direction on protocol now that power had shifted. For one surreal moment, he looked between the chairman, the legal officer, and Zahra herself. Imani noticed. So did half the room. Zahra turned toward the manager and smiled kindly. "Please make sure the kitchen team gets a proper hot meal before the night is over," she said. "And nobody on overnight shift leaves without transport home arranged and confirmed." The manager blinked, then nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." That single word traveled farther than a speech. Ma'am. Not Mrs. Balewa. Not guest. Not ex-wife. Owner. Tade closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Zahra was descending from the stage surrounded by editors, investors, and board members. The crowd parted for her instinctively. Not because she demanded it, because the room had already updated its hierarchy. He moved before he fully thought it through. By the time she reached the side corridor near the winter garden, he was there waiting. "Zahra." She stopped. The corridor was quieter than the ballroom, lined with dark wood and mirror panels reflecting distant gold. For the first time that night, they stood without an audience close enough to hear every breath. He looked at her differently now. Not above her, not around her. At her. "I didn't know," he said. "I know." Something in the answer made his jaw tighten. "You planned this?" "Yes." "For how long?" She considered him, then gave him the courtesy of truth. "Longer than your fiancé has been practicing that smile." He almost laughed. Almost. But shame is heavy where arrogance used to live, and he was only beginning to understand its weight. "You should have told me," he said. And the moment the words left him, both of them heard how absurd they were. Zahra's expression did not change. "Told you what?" she asked softly. "That I could do exactly what you said I couldn't? That I learned more from being underestimated than you learned from being admired?" He looked away first. That had never happened before. "I was wrong," he said. She did not rush to comfort him, did not ease the embarrassment, did not rescue him from himself. "Yes," she said, "you were." The simplicity of it landed harder than anger. He swallowed. Is this revenge? And there it was. The question people like Tade always ask when the person they tried to diminish becomes powerful enough to ignore them. They think the new success must still revolve around them. They imagine themselves central even in the aftermath of their own irrelevance. Zahra studied him with something almost like pity. "No," she said. "If this were revenge, I would have needed your suffering to enjoy it. I don't." From the ballroom came another burst of applause. Her name, carried in fragments, moved through the air like a new currency. She stepped slightly closer. Not intimate, not cruel, just precise. "You once told me I would never matter in rooms like this without your protection," she said. "Tonight I learned something useful, Tade. You were half right." He frowned faintly. She held his gaze. "I don't need protection here anymore," she said. "Everyone else does." Then she moved past him. He did not try to stop her, because some losses arrive too late to negotiate. By the time Zahra re-entered the ballroom, the mood had transformed from spectacle to pursuit. Investors wanted meetings, journalists wanted exclusives, architects wanted contracts. Cultural foundations wanted partnership discussions. Former skeptics wanted proximity. Staff wanted to know if jobs were safe. Zahra answered what mattered, deferred what could wait, and wrote down 3 names the way generals mark terrain. Imani avoided her. Not because she was afraid of scandal, because she was afraid of being seen in the wrong relation to power. That is the real fear in elite spaces, not morality, positioning. Near the end of the night, one business journalist finally asked the question everyone had been circling from different angles. "Ms.
Mensah," he said, microphone lifted as cameras leaned in. "What would you say to people who thought you were finished?" The room quieted once more. Zahra looked toward the ballroom entrance where, earlier that night, Imani had suggested the staff door. Then she looked up at the chandelier, then out at the city beyond the high windows where Johannesburg glowed against the dark like a promise sharpened by survival. When she answered, her voice was almost gentle. "I would say they made the oldest mistake in the world," she said. "They judged a season and assumed they understood the soil." Silence. Then she added, "The most expensive lesson some people ever learn is that humiliation is not the same thing as defeat." This time, even the people who had once laughed with Imani clapped first. By 12:40 a.m., the gala was already becoming headline material. Analysts called the acquisition brilliant. Lifestyle pages called Zahra the surprise story of the year. Hospitality experts called Amani House the most disciplined emerging luxury group on the continent. Social media clips of the key handover spread with breathtaking speed. Millions would watch them by morning. The stunned faces, the chairman's announcement, the shift in the room,
the elegance of Zahra's expression, the quiet force of a woman no longer asking anyone where she belonged. But the moment that stayed with the staff was simpler. Before leaving, Zahra went to the service corridor. She thanked the night manager, asked the pastry team if the overtime count had been corrected, told a housekeeper with swollen ankles to sit down for 5 minutes and let someone else finish polishing the silver trolley. No cameras were there. No reporters followed. No applause came. But 3 employees would later say the same thing in different words. She was the first owner who looked at us like we were visible. Outside, the air had turned colder. The chauffeur opened the door of a black sedan waiting beneath the awning, but Zahra did not enter immediately. She stood for a moment on the stone steps of the Lion's Crown and looked back at the hotel windows glowing above her. Inside those walls, people were still rearranging their loyalties. They were still reinterpreting the past in ways that made them appear less cruel than they had been. They were still telling themselves they had always sensed something exceptional in her. That was fine. History is often edited by the same people who misread it in real time. What mattered was not their version.
What mattered was the deed, the staff list, the signed transfer, the capital plan, the new operating model, the future that had just become enforceable. Nandi stepped beside her with a tablet tucked under one arm. The Kigali investors want a breakfast call. The Dakar Group wants in on Phase 2, and the architecture firm in Marrakesh just sent a proposal. Zahra smiled. "Good," she said. Nandi glanced back toward the ballroom. "Do you want to know what they're saying in there?" Zahra looked ahead. "No," she said. "If they need me now, they can schedule properly." Nandi laughed. The driver opened the rear door again. This time, Zahra entered. As the car pulled away from the curb, the Lion's Crown reflected across the tinted glass. Grand, glittering, expensive, and no longer owned by the people who thought prestige alone could preserve it forever. Somewhere inside, Tade Balewa was probably still standing in a corridor, replaying the night like a sentence. Somewhere inside, Imani Dube was learning that inviting another woman to be humiliated becomes a terrible plan when that woman arrives holding tomorrow in her hands. Zahra leaned back against the seat and finally let herself exhale. Not with bitterness, not with vengeance, with completion. Because years earlier, a man had mistaken her silence for smallness. A room had mistaken her exclusion for irrelevance. A society had mistaken polish for superiority. And tonight, before midnight, the woman they once thought should enter through the staff door became the owner of the building where they learned her name properly. Not as somebody's wife, not as somebody's mistake, not as somebody's cautionary tale. As Zahra Mensah. A woman who was underestimated for so long that she had time to become unavoidable.